Hi everybody, Adam Steele here, and I'm not in my usual place. I am at John Brown's studio, and I happen to have some time to film on my own, and it's a perfect opportunity to answer some questions from our patrons on Patreon. It's the kind of thing where you can, get to know what I do a little bit better. It's not a kind of set video. This is just answering your questions. So there are some questions on there from the Discord. The link to that is in the description below, but most of this is from the patrons on Patreon. So without further ado, let's pull up some of those questions. Colin Henderson says, did you have a mentor as a young producer in training or someone you most admired? Well, a bit of both. I was always very driven to kind of produce in a style that kind of was the sound of the time. So Andy Wallace was a big kind of hero of mine because he could do these big, clean sounding full mixes. Also, a lot of the stuff that Ross Robinson was doing in the early 2000s with Slipknot, Korn, and those kind of guys was very mid-heavy, very focused, but still somehow kind of clear. Andy Sneap was a big influence for the same reason, big, thick guitar and drum sounds, but without it being mushy. I didn't really have a particular mentor until the last year of my formal training, where Mark Minot, who is the lead guitarist and songwriter in a band called Kill to This, became one of the tutors at the university where I studied, University of Huddersfield. And he's a real character. He's got these very laser-focused ideas about how to have the right drive and be successful in the music industry. A lot of his mixing techniques, especially at the time, I learned a lot from them, and strangely enough, I decided I don't do a lot of the things that he does. He's incredibly particular about things like getting all the drum microphones of a performance and aligning the phase, where I go the other way and leave it natural because kind of the propagation of sound, in my opinion, leads to a size and a depth rather than a phase accuracy. Little things like that where that's kind of, now I know why I do what I do, so I learned something from that anyway. But what I learned most from Mark was don't be afraid of people. When people say no, okay, why? Is there anything I can do to change your mind? Kind of developing a reputation in the industry and doing things by determination and getting the skills to be good at everything that isn't just the mix. That was something that I learned that really affected my life going forward. It wasn't just be the best mixer in the world and that'll be great, because if nobody knows who you are and nobody's giving you the jobs because they've never heard of you, what good is it? So that's the kind of thing that I learned from Mark Minot. Kevin Grenier says, what made you decide to become a sound engineer? Well, no one thing made me decide that. I've always been obsessed with sound, quality of sound, getting things to sound good. I was brought up in a house where we had a really nice hi-fi system. My mum and dad were both obsessed with listening to music, mostly rock and metal, but also really well-produced pop and anything from there was some classical stuff on the house, all that kind of stuff. But the kind of common thread to a lot of it was you could hit play and it would just sound, for lack of a better word, cinematic. And I always, as a kid, liked music better that sounded big and cinematic and polished than music that didn't. And even from way younger than being the kind of kid who could put that into words, or even explain it, or even identify that, I just knew I liked things that I considered to be good sound more than things that weren't good sound. Of course, a really good song does give something way more weight than the sound. But if you've got a really good song and it sounds bad and the same song sounds good, I'm going to go with the one that sounds good. And what that means has been the journey of my life since being really little. There was one key moment. I was 17 years old and I'd been in bands that were getting some moderate local success. I'd been recording on a computer with Sonar. We're talking 20 years ago now. And I think I'd been playing around with stuff like, EJ. As a little kid, I used to record pretend radio shows onto a tape deck with a cheap microphone and a second tape deck to transfer songs over. So, I was always into doing that kind of thing, but what changed it for me is at 17 years old, I got a 2-week placement, which is what my college did. College for English people is 16 to 18 years old, so that's kind of like late stage high school. So what we call college is, late high school. But I got a 2-week placement at a university, which is what Americans call college, and I was put in there to help record 30 bands using a 24-track analog desk all into a copy of Sonar in 3 days. So I think we had a day to set up the studio in this university. It was for everybody's assignments being recorded where they were conducting and directing a band. And so my job was to, every band that came in, see if they needed anything different from the last one, see if there were any changes needed to be made on the desk. They got 3 takes, and that was it. We hit record and go. And so over 3 days, I recorded and live mixed on the fly. As a 17-year-old, 30 bands. So I got like 2 or 3 CDs worth of material out of this. And that was a real trial by fire. Now, when I listen back to it, it's not the most incredible sounding work I've ever done, for sure. But that was a real, oh my word, this is incredible. And around that time, I also discovered that you could take computers, which I was obsessed with, and music that I was obsessed with, put them together and actually make a living out of it. And so I swiftly changed from applying for degrees in chemistry. I was going to go and be a chemist and make things explode and fizz and go boom. And I changed over to music production, and that led me on the path that I'm on now. Joel Boone asks, I'm using your mixes of my songs as reference mixes right now to try and learn. Awesome. I cannot get anywhere near the amount of controlled low end as you got. Is there a secret to it that you use, or would you be willing to share? I mean, there's no big secret to getting big controlled low end. There are lots of techniques that I use depending on what the source material is. It's all about what do you have and what do you want to get it to do. And that could be the same for any mixing. It sounds overly simple, but that's the entire concept of mixing distilled down for me, is what do you have, as in what does the source material sound like, and where do you want it to go as the end product, and really be aware of those two things. And the middle is the mix, but I'm never just twiddling knobs and hoping for the best. I'm listening to, say, the kick drum and thinking about an ideal end product, and I'm going, well, this source has too much of this, it doesn't have enough of this. And making those moves based on what I kind of hear in my imagination of where I'm going. For low end, I do tend to take a lot of low end away from instruments that shouldn't have it, like guitars, vocals. I take a surprising amount of low end out of vocals, because otherwise that on its own sounds fine. Suddenly you mix it in with the other instruments, and the low end is woofy and mushy and sounds like too much. And it's also, especially in rock and metal for me, the relationship between the kick drum and the bass guitar. And for me, the bass guitar can have a very solid, consistent low end. So you can use a multi-band compressor usually for that. Or if you are the kind of person that uses 1 amp for the low end and 1 amp for the high end, really heavily compress or limit the one with the low end in it to keep it solid. That works. And the kick drum is the opposite for me, that has very much the boom, here and gone. You hear a lot of kind of natural kick drums recorded and they go bwom, 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 with this big ring on it, and that has to go. If I'm tracking a band, I will make sure I control and muffle the kick drum itself so that it doesn't ring for more than maybe half a second or even less. So it goes ba, 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 not this big bong kind of thing. If that's not the case in the mix, then I will quite heavily gate the kick drum so that it's there, boom, and it's gone. And then I'll play around with EQ on the kick drum to make sure that any nasty boxy frequencies aren't there. And then it doesn't matter to me if the kick and the bass are going at the same time. You'll see some engineers going, oh, side chain this, side chain that. And for me, no, in rock and metal, if you've got your elements right, there's no need to do any of that, because the kick is supposed to be louder than the bass, but only for the time in which it is hitting. Only for that bop. Which is why, if the bass guitar is really consistent, the kick drum can be maybe 6 dB louder than it, but it just goes bop, 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 and appears over the top of the bass. And there's no compression needed, there's no clever EQ move needed, there's no sidechain needed. It just works. Now, when we get to mix bus compression, I'm usually quite gentle with that. But that and a kind of a final limiting will do a little bit of control on that anyway, and will introduce a little bit of kind of very, very fast release kind of ducking. But I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear pumping. I don't want to hear any ba-wah, ba-wah, ba-wah on the bass guitar. It makes me feel dizzy. So yeah, for me, it's just a case of controlling the two against each other. Danny Boy says, I'm sitting here repairing an audio snake, and a question popped into my head. How much routine maintenance do you do on your studio gear? Oh, do you have set times where you give analog gear a good dusting internally? Sort of like a preventative maintenance schedule? Asking for a friend, not asking for a friend. I have to admit, I don't do very much gear maintenance. It's kind of bad of me, I should do more. But in general, I've found over the years, I just try and buy equipment that doesn't really need maintenance. In the early days of the studio, we had patch bays where I had soldered every point on myself, all done by me. A lot of the cables were in the studio were made by me as well, or one of our interns at the time. And over time, they would all break. They would need maintenance. They would need repair. And most of it turns out, is because I'm just not very good at that. I mean, I can do soldering, especially on components that are never going to move, but for whatever reason, my consistency isn't there, and if I practiced a lot, it would get better. But instead, I went down the kind of idea of buy better, more solid, well-made equipment that shouldn't break, and then your repair time is reduced massively. Like the cable that I'm using on this shotgun mic right now, I used to make my own, and now I got Adam from Rain Custom Audio to make me a load of cables that have a star quad cabling inside, which is more expensive. But if one of those four plus shielding, if one of them breaks, I still have a solid contact on the other cable in that, on the other wires in that cable. So I'm much less likely to run into a problem where a balanced cable breaks and becomes unbalanced in the studio and introduces noise. I'm a lot less likely to get into those situations in the first place. I am due to recap all the vintage BBC preamps. I bought all the capacitors now, they're ready to go. But finding time is hard. As a studio guy, I do have the luxury that a lot of my stuff doesn't move very often. It doesn't really need physical maintenance, whereas as a live sound guy, I know a lot of stuff gets kicked and beaten and dropped. A lot of my stuff that's gone out live, I just have equipment that is, this is my live equipment, and I always carry spares of everything, spare cables, spare everything. And I've got to the point where, like, if a patch cable breaks, I will replace it, and then I'll discard the cable because the amount of time and effort it would take me to repair it, I don't have that time, and it's not worth my time. Everybody has a thing they need more of. And when I was first starting out, I needed more money. So I would buy cheap cables or affordable cables and then solder them myself. And that I'm not flush with cash, but the thing I don't have now is time. I have a young family. I do a lot of video editing for other companies too. I'm with John Brown today. I've got all the stuff I do, produce like a pro, etc, etc. I'm just incredibly busy. And so if something's not working, I get a replacement in there and I end up spending money on the replacement and getting another spare. That doesn't mean that's the right thing for everybody, but that's what I have to do. Because the other option would be, you know, something like hire an intern to repair all the gear. And you can't really do that. You know, you can't really have free labor in this country. You've got to, at the very least, you know, pay for people's travel expenses, and then you really should be paying people, and then that kind of thing becomes really expensive really fast. And compared to the cost of a new cable, I just buy a new cable, you know. I'd like to have interns, but that's a whole different conversation. That's just so much more. That's the next step for a business like mine. It's difficult. Question from Blues Cruise. Favorite Reaper actions or custom ones you've created to save time? Well, I generally use Reaper in its pretty much stock setting, but the fact that you can change things makes it really, really useful. And there are 3 things that come to mind that I have customized that really work for my workflow. One of them is an action that doesn't have a button assigned to it, which seems really weird, which is, I think it's called remove silence. The, you know, kind of trim items, remove silence, which is like strip silence in Pro Tools or Cubase or whatever. And it can save me a lot of time when somebody sends me a multi-track mix and it's a big block of WAV files with big blank bits in, because that can just quickly chop them all up depending on a dB threshold that I set so that I can get above a noise floor, all that kind of stuff. And that can make a very quick kind of mix where I can see where there is no audio. Another one is something that I had in Cubase originally, which I think was Shift and Z, which is if I've selected an item, it's a shortcut that makes the time selection that item, which saves me a lot of time because I'll go select item, do a thing, select item, timeline, do a thing. The other one that I've added is Alt and Z, which is a shortcut I've added to crop a section out. It's like ripple delete in Premiere, where if I've got a section, I used to do a lot of work, corporate work for things like voiceovers or audio books, that kind of thing. And if there's a big silence gap, I could just select that and then hit Alt Z, and that would just delete everything in that little section and concertina everything in and just move everything that's later in by that much. And that saves me huge amounts of time because I'm not having to select files and drag them around or move tempo changes or markers or anything. Everything just moves, and that's indispensable for a lot of what I used to do. So those are my customizing options right there. And that's it for this Patreon Q&A. Thanks everybody for putting your questions in. We'll do another one soon. If everybody wants to put questions down below, then I'll collect them from YouTube as well as Patreon and Discord, where you can help us to do more videos like this. Thanks, John, for letting me use the space, even though you're not here yet. And thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.